So one of the heirloom Native American varieties of squash I grew in my garden this year is this elongated orange variety. It's called Gete Okosomin, and in the Menominee language that translates to cool old squash or big old squash. And this squash became pretty famous over the last couple of years, in part because somewhere along the line someone fabricated a story and kind of started a hoax saying that seeds were found in an 800-year-old clay pot and they planted them and grew this squash. And that turns out to not be true. It was all over all the news stories, and everyone was trying to get their hands on the seeds of this ancient squash. And the truth is, it's really a cool squash. It's been grown by the Menominee people for thousands of years and handed down. And it's a great variety, but it was not found in a clay pot, some seeds that are 800 years old. That was just a fabricated story. But I'm still enjoying growing it this year. It has a cool history, even though it was not 800-year-old seeds, and I'm going to enjoy eating it this year. It's been about a month since we've harvested the squash. I brought them into our garage where it's cool and dry, and these are great keeper squash, so you can pull them out as you need them throughout the winter, and they don't rot, and they last for many months. The flesh of this is a very smooth texture, and it has a great taste. It's slightly sweet with a hint of melon. Can be used on any recipes that you would use a butternut squash. And these are huge. This one we weighed was 20 pounds. I planted 8 plants, had 8 seeds, and I got over 20 fruit from these. And they ranged anywhere from 5 pounds up to the 25 pounds. And they're full of seeds. The seeds are a hot commodity right now. Baker Creek Heirloom Seed is one of the largest seed companies. They're offering them. You can get 10 seeds for $6, but they have a limited supply. We're going to cut this open, and we're going to use part of this for a soup for our Thanksgiving meal, and then we're going to cut up and roast some for the Thanksgiving meals. Keep your fingers clear so you don't cut yourself. And here's what the squash looks like inside. There's not a huge space in the middle. It's got quite a bit of flesh, so a lot of that weight is very much usable for good eating flesh. And then here's the seeds, so I'll start scooping these out with the spoon and saving them. And as you pull away this kind of pulpy membrane, you'll just see all those seeds in there. So I've removed all the seeds, and we'll get to this real soon for our soup. But the first thing I'm going to do is start to separate the seeds from the pulp and do a quick count. I'm going to rinse these really well and then lay them out to dry. The first squash I did, I saved all the seeds, I laid them out for over a week, and they looked really dry, so I put them away and checked them a week later, and they had all molded. You got to dry squash seeds, not touching each other in the open air for a long time to make sure that they don't mold, and store them in a place that's very cool and dry. This squash was 20 pounds and had 322 seeds, but about 20 of those were split or underdeveloped. So I think I got about 300 viable seeds out of this one squash. Now that we have all the seeds and pulp scraped out, we're ready to bake this flesh. I'm going to cut them up to the size appropriate for putting on this pan, and then I'll turn that over to my wife, who's the cook in the family. Alright, now I'll turn it over to my wife.
So today we're going to be making roasted butternut squash soup, or in this case our winter squash soup. And the reason why we want to roast the squash is, one, these are gigantic and they're kind of hard to handle otherwise, but they also bring out, the roasting process brings out a great sweetness in the squash. And then I'm not a huge fan of like the cinnamony, nutmeggy taste that a lot of butternut squash soups have. And so when I make my own, I like to kind of put a little twist on it by using tart green apple, shallots and onion, garlic, and then some seasoning, which we actually use some fresh sage, as well as some ground coriander, and of course some good old chicken broth, as well as salt and pepper and olive oil. So these flavors really lend itself to more of a savory flavored soup. So if you haven't liked butternut squash soup previously, I challenge you to try this recipe because I am now a believer. But the first thing you want to do is just use a little bit of olive oil, and really just a small amount, maybe a couple tablespoons per squash piece. And you'll just drizzle it on, and then this is really to keep the squash from getting really hard and crunchy in the oven. You just rub it on, and then you'll want to generously salt and pepper, and I like to use kosher salt and fresh ground pepper. And I've set my oven to 425 degrees. And in most cases, if you were using a butternut squash, which is not nearly as thick as this squash, you'd roast for about an hour. In the case of using this gigantic squash, we're looking probably closer to an hour and a half or 2 hours. You want to make sure that it's nice and fork tender when it's done so that it will puree really nicely. So we'll salt, fresh ground pepper all throughout, and we'll throw it in our oven, 425 degrees. And I would check on it in an hour, but we're probably looking more like an hour and a half or 2. The next step for making our squash soup is to get our aromatic softening. So we're going to add 1 chopped onion, and this is 3 shallots. And because everything's going to be pureed, you don't have to have everything in a perfect dice. We'll get these softening here. And this was just in about a tablespoon or 2 of olive oil. Our onions and shallot have obviously started to soften a bit. Now we're going to add the rest of the base of our soup. And we'll start with about 4 tart Granny Smith apples, approximately 16 sage leaves, and then about 8 to 10 cloves of garlic. And that's just roughly chopped again because we're going to just puree. We'll just stir this up and let everything soften a bit. And at this point I will sprinkle some salt on there just to kind of bring out the moisture of our aromatics. The squash has now roasted for about an hour and 45 minutes, and as you can see as we open this oven door, very nice and soft, very fork tender. I'm going to pull it out and get it cooling. I'm going to scoop out the contents of our squash here, and actually just to kind of give you a little window into what this tastes like. It's really sweet, and honestly, you could scoop it out and eat it just like this. It's really delicious. In some ways, you could just mash it up and treat it like a mashed potato. It's delightful, but what we're going to do is remove the contents of the squash and put them in a bowl while our aromatics are cooking and getting soft. Alright, so we're at the point where we can add our squash to our soup and then add some liquid so that it can get simmering. And as you can see here, we have a lot of squash and we'll be able to make a lot of soup. So we'll just add the squash, and I have about a quart of water that we'll add, and then I have some low sodium chicken broth as well, just to add some richness. If you want to keep it entirely vegetarian, you can just use vegetable broth or just water. Just make sure you check your seasonings for salt and pepper. And we'll stir this together. The soup has been simmering for about 10 minutes and everything's softened well. And we're ready to puree our soup in batches. And so what I like to do is puree it, add it to a large bowl, and then we'll add it back to the pot and finish our seasonings to make sure they're to taste. Alright, so we've added about 3/4 of the way up in our blender to blend, and then I took off the steam vent because you do have a hot liquid in there, it might become explosive. So the best thing is to leave a vent, but to place a kitchen towel over the top so you don't have molten soup splashing everywhere. We just go ahead and put it on. And then we just add it into our bowl. And keep going. Here's the final soup. We like to garnish with a few toasted pumpkin seeds. And it's very delicious. And one of the great things about this soup is if you have any friends or family that have dietary issues, whether they can't have gluten or dairy or even so far as any grain, this soup is great. And if you made it with vegetable broth, you would be able to make it completely vegetarian as well. with that giant squash, we made about 9 quarts of soup. So we will be able to share as well as share with our family on Thanksgiving. So we're really thankful for this beautiful soup and the beautiful squashes we were able to grow in the garden this year.
I love the squash soup.